So, Sister Melanie, it is a great honor to have you back to United. We were comparing notes, and it's been at least pre-pandemic where everything is marked from, at least 4 or 5 years since you've blessed us both with your preaching and at times also with your singing. So it's great to have you here. There's a bit of a bio in the bulletin about the Reverend Melanie Harris. She currently lives in Wake Forest, North Carolina, where she's on the faculty there, teaching womanist theology and also biblical studies. Before that, she was at Texas Christian University as the first African-American woman on the religion staff at TCU. So she's been a groundbreaker in all kinds of ways, and she was raised very well by her mother, Reverend Naomi Harris, and both Reverend Naomi and also Reverend Melanie are ordained pastors in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the historic black congregations of this country. But before that, she was a student. She was a PhD student at Union Seminary in New York City, where she studied with Professor Larry Rasmussen and got to be good friends with both Larry and Nyla. And they're sort of surrogate grandparents right now to John Asante, right? Mm-hmm. And before that, you were a broadcast journalist. Mm-hmm. You worked for various affiliates like ABC and NBC and did other kinds of things. So, Melanie, give us some background. Where did you grow up, and how did you make the leap from an honorable profession like broadcast journalism into teaching at a seminary and being a minister? So what's been the journey?
Thank you so much, Pastor Talitha. Thank you all so much for the gift of being back home at United. It is a gift and an honor to be with you, indeed, and with the whole family. I give special thanks to God for the gift of the presence of my parents, Larry and Nyla Rasmussen, and for my mom, Reverend Naomi. It is a gift to have so many parents because it means more wisdom. I am deeply grateful. My Santa Fe parents have been with me through a lot of the journey, as have you, Reverend Talitha. A lot of the journey through Texas. Anybody from Texas? You know the journey of Texas. It is indeed a practice of faith to be able to emerge from those spaces and then to find life in this space, in the beauty of Santa Fe, New Mexico. My journey began in the gift of the wisdom of Naomi Harris and John Harris Sr., but before that, through Bessie Wells and her husband, William Wells, and my father's parents, Lucy Harris and Singleton Harris. Mm-hmm. Those two powerful people fell in love. And that was a really amazing thing to be able to do as African Americans moving through the Jim and Jane Crow South in Mississippi. My grandmother, Lucy Harris, was part African American and also part Cherokee and Blackfoot, Native American. And so our bloodline carries the ancestral tradition of all of those peoples and all of those prayers. Lucy Harris and Singleton Harris migrated from Mississippi all the way to Deerfield, Colorado, and became one family of 30 families who began one of the first black settlements in the country, an all-black farming community that really was an effort to create racial solidarity, but also racial justice in the West. And so they brought all the wisdom that they could from Mississippi, agricultural wisdom and knowledge, their spirituality with the earth, from Mississippi all the way here to Denver, Colorado.
Great. Melanie, before you continue on, let's readjust your mic. Yeah, because your stool's on top of it.
Oh,
so let's put it on your stole. What you're saying is way too important.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I think
better?
that'll be. It was sort of underneath the stole. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can see Elijah back there sweating bullets. So.
Thank you, Elijah.
Okay.
Thank you. So the gift of love and kind of radical love is actually how I really came to be, and it's radical love and racial justice. I did grow up in Denver, Colorado. I have a phenomenal mother who raised me with a wonderful other human being, a little brother, by the name of John Arberia Harris Jr. He is a wonderful man and a wonderful man of faith and love, a father of 3 children. He and his wife live in Orlando. My brother and I actually grew up in a very welcoming and hospitable home. And my father was the first African-American city planner in the city and county of Denver, Colorado. My mother started as an educator, educating all of the littles and all the way through high school. What I didn't know is that my mother had a call into ministry. But because she grew up in a very Southern and Baptist home, it wasn't until I was a teenager that she began to allow the Spirit to really echo in her own heart what it might be like to become an ordained minister. So when I came out with my pride and joy, Spelman College graduate, I actually entered into Ilo School of Theology and started thinking about a career of actually sharing the news, starting in broadcast journalism, but also sharing the good news. It was, I think, the gift of nurturing that I was actually able to move through my Masters of Divinity that began to echo a deep, deep call and confirmation in my mother's journey. And so my mom watched me go into ministry first, and she came right behind. It is a gift then to have shared so much of my life and my professional life and ministry life with my mother, Reverend Dr. Naomi Harris. She received an MDiv and then later received a doctorate of ministry at Ilo School of Theology. So a lot of our journey has been in sisterhood together, in ministry and in faith.
Great, thank you, thank you. So part of your bio talks about the fact that you teach womanist theology. And again, before we start up, Elijah, should she switch the mic to the other side? Or just lower it down a little bit? Okay, there we go.
Is that good?
Is that good? Can you all hear her back there? Okay, good, all right. This is too, if it were me, it wouldn't matter, but you're speaking, so we got to pick you up for sure. So, okay, so part of your bio is that you teach, quote, womanist theology. And I did share with you that there are probably 3 people in this room who might know what womanist theology is. You, your mother, maybe 5 people, Larry, Nyla, and me. But maybe there's a few more. But can you explain what womanist theology is?
Yes.
I mean, I know feminist theology, I know queer theology, I know black theology, I know German systematic theology, process theology, liberation theology. What is womanist theology?
Womanist theology is God talk theology from a woman of African descent, from the perspective of those women. And so we actually center the women of African descent and their experience of God, their knowledge of God, their wisdom and experience of God, into thinking about how we understand God talk. So theos is God, and ology literally means talk, essentially. So talking about God, theology. Womanism is a way of actually continuing to open up the margins, create and expand the talk of theology, particularly recognizing that all women don't have the same experience. And in the world of theology, most of the women who came to Voice First were white women. And even though they were working very, very hard to dismantle patriarchy, there were some of the conversations that they were very nervous about having. And some of those conversations were about race and difference in a lot of different ways. Womanism really was born and in many ways, actually, in religion and theology at Union Theological Seminary. And so the great father of Black liberation theology, James Cone, was a great teacher and a wonderful pedagogue. And he had these brilliant Black women as students who kept asking him, what about the women? What about the women?
Right.
What about the women? The church would not exist without the women. And so Dr. Cone, I believe, actually went through a transformation as a man himself, recognizing that any theology that did not actually create open space for Black women to speak and Black women to feel and Black women to experience God wasn't an effective theology. So he challenged himself, and his Black women students challenged him very deeply to interrogate the patriarchy, which was inherent in Black liberation theology. And womanist theology was born out of that space of interrogating patriarchy in the church, and not just the Black church, but the church universal. Womanist theology actually has three mothers, believe it or not. The womanist theology and religion group really kind of coined the term womanist by Alice Walker, who's the author, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Color Purple and many, many powerful volumes. She herself is not a theologian nor an ethicist in that right, but a powerful activist and a powerful writer, particularly in environmental justice and earth care. And so it was her term, womanist, that really became fodder for Katie Cannon and Dolores Williams and many other womanist theologians to grab a hold of, in part because it recognized a kind of isness and beingness and power of being a Black woman and honoring Black women's spirituality. That particular term for Alice was important in part because it created a wave beside feminist thought that was happening at the time. She, by coming up with the term womanist, really was echoing back into the feminist corner that race is important, and the race, class, gender, sexual orientation, the complex subjectivity that is all of us, but is especially Black women, is all important, that you actually can't do justice work without looking at all of the intersections of justice work, that we ourselves are not just human beings, but beings on the planet in addition to trees and plants and animals, etc. And that sense of beingness is a kind of spirituality that Alice Walker really gave to womanist theologians. But at the same time, there were actually two other theorists who were coming up with the term something like womanism. Clenora Hudson Weems was one who was working in the field of Africana studies, and then we also credit a lot of the work to African women. Mercy Oduyuye was one who was challenging the term of feminism, even at that time, a Ghanaian West African theologian. So we thank all of these powerful women. It is important to recognize that womanist theology and womanist ethics actually has more than one mother. More than one mother. More than one mother. And that the variety of spiritualities and recognitions and wisdoms that come from all of these traditions actually help to create a kind of wholeness of care, really echoing into the fullness of spirituality. So it's okay to have three parents or more.
Some of us have more. That's right, absolutely. So with all of that as a sort of a background for this scripture that you read just so beautifully, so from your perspective, because you wear a lot of hats too. You're a womanist theologian, you're a parent, you're a daughter, you're a teacher, you wear many, many hats. So what do you do with this passage written by a specific person named Paul, his background was both Jewish and a Roman citizen? He was probably from the Middle East, but he's writing this from Rome. We don't know whether or not he was ever married. We don't know whether or not he ever had children. One probably hopes that he didn't. We do know that he traveled around and was a great orator and tried to get churches started. But he was a person of his time as well. And now he's sitting in a prison cell at the end of his life, having given his best shot to a multitude of churches all around the known world. And he writes these words, still very much under the shadow of the Roman Empire. Rome's name is on everything, and Caesar's picture as the picture of God is on everything too. And he's preaching a different gospel, about God and about this Jesus Christ and all of that. And so he writes these words about nothing being able to separate us from God's love. From your perspective, with all the hats you wear, whether as a womanist theologian or a professor of biblical studies or a parent or all those hats, those roles that you have, how does this passage speak to you? What does it say to you?
Yeah.
Because if you go deep enough into what it says to you, we can go deep into what it says to us as well.
I thank you for the question. There's a gift of the interconnectedness, of wovenness of heart that we all share in the space, even as we share this space together. And indeed, you're right, the echo of the Spirit, I think, is so profound to be able to speak into one heart. Hopefully will also speak into your hearts. When I lost my father at age 20, I remember being introduced to this passage really for the first time. And there was something really important for me to hear, that there was no separation of the love of God that we both had. That he indeed had a deep love for God. Now, he worked all week long hours, as did my mother, and they were raising these fabulous children.
Of course.
That took a lot of work and a lot of energy. So one of my most vivid memories of my father is that by the time we got to Sunday, he would actually sit on the corner of the pew and he would doze off in the middle of the sermon. Because
that happens here too occasionally.
But inevitably, when we would all get home and have supper after Sunday, he would have some of the most profound theological thoughts about having been in community of faith together. Resting in God was one of the most profound teachings that he gave me as a child. To be in a safe space, particularly as a person of color in America, to be able to find sacred rest in a safe space on a Sunday morning, and to be able to commune with God in the fullness of every open heart around them. To be able to know God in that way was particularly important. Even sleep could not separate him from the love of Jesus Christ. So when he fell into his final sleep, I remembered that he was resting in God, and that I could too be a part of that resting, that I could be with him, because God's love was big enough to transform sleep, to transform even final sleep, that the love of God was permeated all of that, so that I didn't lose him. So when he returned to me through Papa Larry, I was so surprised. But the love of God in my father, I recognize as the same love of God that I feel in my Papa. Now, for me, that was pretty revolutionary, because my father was African American, and Larry is African in a lot of ways, but he actually comes from a different lineage. He, in this country, is considered white. How is it possible that the love of God transcends race and the racial construction that we have created? How is it possible that all of the study I did on racial analysis and anti-racism, all of the ways of separating that our society teaches us on how to congregate and how to be, how is it possible that all of that fell away when I experienced the love of God? It's because God is not racial separation. God is deeper. Race is beautiful, and can be glorious, and difference can be and is very important. And it's not the only way to experience the love of God. Nyla's granola is another evidence of God's love in my life.
The granola that Nyla Rasmussen makes. I would second that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So to experience the hospitality of Christ in their family is to experience there is no separation in God. I think the other thing I would add is that this kind of passage and the kind of bravery that Paul writes about, we are more than conquerors, has often in my life, as a survivor of many things, many different kind of traumas, I have recognized that even when I feel that I am not victorious, that I've lost everything, that there is such strength in declaring I have victory in Christ Jesus. I have victory over racism. I have victory over trauma. I have victory, even if it is only to breathe in that day, that by the very breath that we breathe, that is victory. You've won. Now, for someone who's an academic and has a relatively large ego, that winning is really important. So I appreciate, even though that language is so filled of logic of domination, I appreciate Paul being flawed in that way, to consider that this is a winning thing. It's a warfare. And I think that he does talk about spiritual warfare. We know as spiritual beings that sometimes we can put it in that frame that makes sense to us, that it's important, because sometimes it does feel like you're fighting for your life. You're fighting for hope again. And there's also something really important to recognize, the breathing marks in between the words as it's translated in English from the Bible. That the winning is the fact that you're still breathing, that you still have the capacity to feel God's peace, to feel God's hope, to be God's love. And sometimes in the midst of grief and death, that's all we can do. Breathe. Breathe through it. Breathe in it.
That's why we begin the services every Sunday with breathing in.
Yes.
Because people come into this sanctuary from all their other lives and from everything that's going on in their life, or their family's life, or the world, or whatever. And to be reminded in the midst of the service just to breathe in, to breathe in. And it's interesting, I mean, for Paul to make that statement, we are more than conquerors, that he's writing that in a prison cell.
Yes.
Looking at the end of his life sooner rather than later.
I liken his writing, obviously, to the writing of Martin Luther King Jr.
Absolutely.
in the prison cell, really echoing all these echoes of powerful liberation in the letter from a Birmingham jail. In that, sometimes in our physicality, we feel like we're in a space. Like I remember feeling in a state of depression and feeling like those walls were caving in on me in the prison. But these words actually give me hope, because there is God even in the prison.
Even in the prison,
that
right.
echoes a kind of freedom that you have access to, a kind of freedom. Even in that state, you have access to a kind of freedom that fully liberates. And that is the freedom that we have in the peace of Christ.
And that when Paul talks about nothing can separate us from God, he's not only talking about those things out there, I think he's also talking about all the stuff that's going on inside. It's both and. Whether it's grief or whatever. I mean, you know, Paul was a challenging person. and he also has, you know, he's known his own failures as well as his own high points by the time he writes this. He knows that he hasn't always done what he wanted to do. And he hasn't always been the person who went the extra mile. He was no gentle Jesus, I assure you. But he knows that even that doesn't separate him from God's love. And I think so that for me at least, that's why this passage is so profound. And that it also, what you were saying earlier, Melanie, about the people who have embodied God's love in your life, I invite us as a congregation, each of you individually, who are the 3 to 4 people in your life who have embodied God's love? Regardless of race, age, length of time you knew them, where they were from, how much money they made or didn't make, or all those kinds of things. To see that when your father died, the love didn't end. The love of God was still there. It was just going to get manifested in different kinds of ways. And I think that's really important for us, no matter what our age or how we move through life, because if we haven't already, we will lose people that are dear and caring for us. And how do you take the next step after that?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that receiving that love, right, being in a place of open-heartedness to receive the love. I remember being challenged by the gifts that God presented to my life as full love. Some of it was that I didn't feel like I was worthy to receive such great love. And I had wrapped myself pretty strongly in a very independent, march through it all, superwoman mentality, so that I felt like I didn't need anyone. I don't need the love of God. I'm doing it all on my own, which is easy to do, as an independent person. But when one comes to a point in your life where you realize, I cannot do this by myself. I need God. I need the love of God. And in my case, I needed it in a radical way. When God sent Larry and Nyla and many others into my life, when they didn't come in the purple package I expected, I rejected it. It's not purple, God. I don't know what this is for.
That's right.
But it was the essence of God's presence and the persistence of Larry and Nyla continuing to invite me, continuing to allow me to be a part of the church. I believe that was the presence of God saying, I'm not leaving. You can resist me as much as you want, but the love of God is staying here for you. The love of God will always be present, and we'll find different ways of getting in, but God does not leave you. God does not leave us. God persists. God's love persists.
That might be a good note to end on. Just remember that. You remember nothing else out of today. God's love persists. Thank you.
Shay,
Amen.
thank you, Reverend Talitha. Amen.